12:15. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Senate lecture. My name's Tony Machulik and I'm the Clerk Assistant Procedure in the Department of the Senate. We're meeting today at Parliament House, on land where people have been meeting for thousands of years. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area and pay respect to elders past, present, of all Australia's Indigenous peoples. Today's lecture is being live streamed on the Australian Parliament House website and via the Parliament House broadcast system. It's also being Auslan interpreted. If time permits, we'll have questions and answers after the lecture, so please have your questions ready. This month marks 100 years since the Commonwealth Electoral Act was amended to introduce compulsory voting for Commonwealth elections. Reflecting on this occasion for the conversation, one of our lecturers, Emeritus Professor Paul Strangio, described compulsory voting as the most extraordinary feature of Australia's democratic architecture. The anniversary has special significance for the Australian Senate. The bill containing the amendments originated in the Senate as a private senator's bill. To date, it's one of only 16 private senators' bills that have been passed by both houses of Parliament to become law. I'm therefore delighted that Emeritus Professor Paul Strangio and Associate Professor Matteo Bonotti have agreed to present today's Senate lecture to reflect on the historical background, significance and theoretical dimensions of compulsory voting in Australia. Paul Strangio is an Emeritus Professor of Politics in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. A political historian, he's the author and editor of numerous award-winning publications on Australian politics. Matteo Bonotti is Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at Monash University. He's a political theorist whose research interests include democratic theory, linguistic justice and political liberalism. Of particular relevance to today, Professor Strangio and Associate Professor Bonotti co-edited the 2021 Palgrave Macmillan collection, A Century of Compulsory Voting in Australia, Genesis, Impact and Future. Professor Strangio will speak first to outline the historical context in which compulsory voting was introduced at the Commonwealth level and reflect on the factors which have guarded against its abolition. Professor Bonotti will then provide some insights into the theoretical and philosophical dimensions of compulsory voting, with a particular focus on its relationship to political legitimacy. Will you please join me in welcoming Emeritus Professor Paul Strangio to speak first?
Thanks very much, and thank you for attending today's lecture. I'm delighted to see you all, and I'd like to thank the staff from the Senate for organising Matteo and I to be here today. It's great to see this interest, and it's a continuing tradition. It's the third of these lectures I've given over the years, and they're always a treat. I've been thinking about this topic this week, and a thing I've reflected on again is that as a nation, Australia is bashful about extolling its democratic achievements. How else can we explain that this month marks the centenary, as has been said, of the most extraordinary feature of the country's democratic architecture, and yet the anniversary has largely slipped by with scant comment nor reflection? And I'm referring, of course, to compulsory voting, which was legislated in the Federal Parliament in July 1924. Maybe the inattention is also due to the fact that the practice is second nature after 100 years. Habituated to being compelled to participate in elections, we're inured to its specialness. Compulsory voting isn't unique to Australia. Calculating how many countries have compulsory voting is notoriously difficult, since in around half the nations where the practice exists in name, it is not enforced. However, most estimates suggest it's in the vicinity of 20 to 30 nations which have compulsory voting. If not unique, Australia's experience of compulsory voting is distinctive for a number of reasons. First, its emergence in the early 20th century was consistent with the nation's larger tradition of precocious innovation and ready experimentation when it came to electoral institutions and practices. This record is typically trace back to the pioneering in the 1850s of the secret ballot, sometimes called the Australian ballot, in a number of Australian colonies, and the embrace of other advanced democratic measures in the second half of the 19th century. These included manhood suffrage, payment of MPs, and the extension of the franchise to women, beginning in South Australia in 1894. The innovations continued in the 20th century with such things as preferential voting and non-partisan bureaucratic electoral administration. Second, Australia is alone in embracing compulsory voting among the Anglophone democracies to which it typically compares itself. The electoral systems of Britain, Canada, New Zealand and the United States are all based on voluntary voting. Third, unlike many other compulsory voting countries, Australia does not pay lip service to its operation. Compulsory voting is enforced by electoral authorities, albeit leniently, has been strongly upheld by the courts and is backed by a regime of sanctions for non-compliance. Fourth, compulsory voting has been consistently and unambiguously successful in achieving high voter turnout. Though there has been a downtrend in turnout at the past 5 national elections, it hit a low of 90.5% in 2022. It has never fallen below 90% since the adoption of compulsory voting a century ago. This is some 30% higher than the recent average turnout in countries with voluntary voting and also well above the recent average in countries with compulsory voting systems. Fifth is how strongly and consistently the public has backed the practice. Evidence from more than half a century of opinion polls and election study surveys show support hovering around the 70% mark. Perhaps the most singular aspect of the nation's experience of compulsory voting, however, is how seemingly impregnable is the practice if measured by its durability, the dearth of controversy over it, the consistency of its enforcement by authorities, and the way it has been dutifully complied with and supported by citizens. Together, these things make Australia an exemplar of compulsory voting internationally. This is not to say that compulsory voting has been a sacred cow in Australia. In the final decades of the 20th century and the first decade of this century, there was a concerted push to end the practice from within the Liberal Party. The principal torchbearer of the agitation for voluntary voting was the avowed libertarian South Australian Senator Nick Minchin. For Minchin, compulsory voting was an anathema. Quote, "In relation to the most single manifestation of democratic will, the act of voting, I profoundly detest Australia's denial of individual choice. It seems to me that an essential part of a liberal democracy should be the citizens' legal right to decide whether or not to vote. The denial of that right is an affront to democracy," unquote. But Minchin was far from alone in opposing compulsory voting on the Conservative side of politics in this period. A survey of coalition candidates at the 1996 election indicated that 60% favoured voluntary voting. In 1988, the Liberal Party's Federal Council resolved in support of voluntary voting, and that position was also held by the South Australian and Victorian divisions. At the leadership level, among those who were on the record as either opposing compulsory voting or believed it ought to be reviewed were John Hewson, federal leader, 1990 to 1994, Nick Greiner, New South Wales Premier, 1988 to 1992, and Jeff Kennett, Victorian Premier, 1992 to 1999. Most promising for the advocates of voluntary voting was that John Howard, elected Prime Minister in 1996, had been on record as a critic of compulsory voting since entering the federal parliament in 1974. Howard's opposition to the practice appeared to be partially based on the individual rights argument, but also derived from a calculation that its abolition would advantage his side of politics. This was consistent with most of the political science literature, which suggested that compulsory voting narrowly benefited Labor. The cause of voluntary voting was ultimately a futile one. At times, its champions seemed on the cusp of progress, only to be frustrated. In May 1992, early in the Keating Labor government, a coalition shadow cabinet endorsed proposal for a change of policy to voluntary voting was presented to the Liberal National Party room. It provoked strong resistance and was subsequently referred back to the shadow cabinet by the Liberal leader, John Hewson, for it to not see the light of day again. Later that year, Kennett, the Victorian Liberal opposition leader, who was on the verge of winning the premiership, abandoned plans to take a policy of abolishing compulsory voting to the October election. While he personally favoured voluntary voting, Kennett had been dissuaded from pursuing that course by the party's polling that showed overwhelming public support for maintaining the status quo. Similarly, once in office, Kennett spurred calls from the Victorian Liberal division for his government to end compulsory voting. In 1993, in South Australia, there was more promising news for abolitionists, with the election of a Liberal government led by Dean Brown on a platform that included the repeal of compulsory voting. A bill for that purpose passed the South Australian lower house in the first half of 1994, but was narrowly defeated in the upper house by the combined votes of Labor and the Australian Democrats. In 1998, another South Australian Liberal government, led by John Olsen, attempted to legislate voluntary voting, only for that bill to be left languishing in the Legislative Council. The election of the Howard Coalition government in March 1996 was ostensibly a fillip for the voluntary voting cause. In mid-1997, the government bloc on the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, JSEM, which included Minchin, recommended an end to compulsory voting. Quote, "If Australia is to consider itself a mature democracy, compulsory voting should now be abolished," they declared. However, with National Party members opposed to change and with little or no prospect of the required legislation passing through the upper house, the government declined to act on the recommendation. The abolitionists' hopes were raised again when the coalition won control of the Senate at the October 2004 election. Minchin and other supporters of voluntary voting egged on speculation that the future of compulsory voting was under question. Howard responded by dousing down the idea of imminent change, yet left the door ajar to action in the next term. In 2005, though, with the issue causing friction within the coalition, the Prime Minister decisively closed down the issue. Though restating his personal preference for voluntary voting, Howard acknowledged many in his government disagreed, nor had he found the issue a barbecue stopper. Quote, "As I move around the country, I don't get people stopping me in the street and saying, 'You've got to get rid of compulsory voting,'" unquote. In short, at a point when the government was spending large amounts of political capital on one of the Prime Minister's ID fixes, industrial relations deregulation, Howard was unwilling to risk coalition discord or open up another political battle front on a matter about which the public was wholly unperturbed. The debate on compulsory voting thereafter petered out. Moreover, the closure of the Howard era at the November 2007 election effectively left Liberal Party champions of voluntary voting at a dead end. The surest sign they were beaten was Minchin's forlorn admission when delivering his valedictory address to the Senate in June 2011. Quote, "I have fought a lonely and quixotic battle to restore to Australians the legal right to choose whether or not to exercise their right to vote. I have not been able to convince even my own federal parliamentary party of the worth of that great cause." Unquote. So why did the struggle to abolish compulsory voting in Australia conclude in meek defeat? The most fundamental reason is that, as Howard acknowledged in 2005, the public were unexercised over the matter. The near two-decade-long opposition campaign spearheaded out of the Liberal Party abjectly failed to disturb voter acceptance of the system. To the contrary, Australian election study data indicates that support for compulsory voting had declined to a still healthy low of 64% as that campaign gathered force in the late 1980s. But by the time the Howard government lost office in 2007, support had rebounded to an equal record high of 77%. In sum, far from stimulating community concern about the practice, the agitations had coincided with a strengthening of faith in it. What else accounts for the failure of the opponents to seriously threaten compulsory voting and to weaken public satisfaction with it? As Judith Brett persuasively contends, there is an affinity between compulsory voting and Australia's majoritarian political temperament. In that sense, the individual rights argument against compulsion, prosecuted by Minchin and his allies, fell on stony ground. In a pragmatic-minded political culture like Australia's, opponents have also been disadvantaged by the fact that in advocating for voluntary voting, they were typically dependent on abstract principles or untested assertions about what would happen in the circumstances of that change. By contrast, upholders of the status quo have been able to point to demonstrable benefits, not least the consistently high turnout. Equally, the existing system's defences are buttressed by path dependency. As the political scientist Don Aitken noted in the 1960s, quote, "The fact that compulsion applies in all state and federal elections and referenda has helped to perpetuate it as settled policy," unquote. Australian voters, in other words, know no other way. The lack of consensus in favour of voluntary voting within the Liberal Party was another impediment to change. While evidence suggests from the late 1980s that position was ascended in some of the state divisions, support was less reliable where it principally mattered, in the federal parliamentary party. On the one known occasion when the matter was tested in the Coalition Joint Party Room in May 1992, there was a rebellion against a proposed change to a policy of voluntary voting. Some Liberals were genuinely convinced of the democratic value of compulsory voting, while others, contrary to the conventional view that the practice electorally benefited Labor, feared that voluntary voting would gift its opponents because of the voter mobilising force of the trade unions. Moreover, the federal Liberals had to take account of the views of their coalition partner, the National Party. While there were examples of national members supporting the campaign against compulsory voting, in the main that position enjoyed little sympathy in the party and among its leaders. It was more common for Nationals to believe that voluntary voting would penalise the party given their vast regional seats, ageing membership and stretched resources. A final plausible reason why opponents of compulsory voting have proved incapable of rousing public resentment is that the system is not especially oppressive. As frequently pointed out by both opponents and supporters, the compulsion is not to vote per se, but rather for an elector to attend a polling booth, have their name crossed off the electoral roll and receive a ballot paper. Electoral authorities have also generally treated non-compliance leniently. Typically, among those who offer an explanation for their non-compliance, only a small number are judged to have provided an inadequate reason, and only a minuscule proportion of them are eventually convicted. And of those who have been jailed rather than pay the small fine for failing to vote, there have been few, if any, high-profile conscientious objectors or martyrs to the cause of non-voting. All of this leads to the conclusion that compulsory voting is a highly resilient institution in Australia. Of course, we cannot rule out opposition to it, despite currently being dormant but stirring, as happened in the 1980s. For the foreseeable future, though, Australia's compulsory voting regime is robust and secure. Though enjoying sustained and widespread public support, compulsory voting's importance to Australia's democratic system, I think, is underappreciated. Moving to a conclusion, I'd like to suggest then that it is one of the ingredients of the nation's democratic exceptionalism. One of the reasons why the political centre holds better here than in many other comparable societies. Writing a few years ago, the eminent historian Stuart McIntyre observed that unlike in the United States and parts of Europe, right-wing populist politics has not really taken root in Australia. This may be too sanguine an interpretation. It is the case that, as McIntyre asserted, insurgencies such as Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party have been mostly ephemeral. Yet my view is that beginning with the era of Howard's prime ministership, particularly from 2001 onwards, conservative populism has been smuggled into mainstream Australian politics through the Liberal Party's rightward ideological pivot. Still, McIntyre's fundamental point stands. Australia has been more resistant to political extremism than have advanced democracies in Europe and North America. Australia has endured nothing commensurate to a Trump or Brexit moment. Why? One answer is that not without substantial destabilising effects, the big modernising reforms executed in the final decades of the 20th century by the Labor governments of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and the early Howard government laid the foundations for a robust economy that has helped to insulate the nation from the drastic austerity measures and severe erosion of living standards experienced in many other countries. In a similar way, the global financial crisis of the first decade of the 21st century was, compared to its severe economic and social effects in other parts of the globe, mostly harmlessly shrugged off by Australia. This resilience was again attributed to the reforms of the previous quarter of a century, as well as the good fortune of the nation's buoyant trade relationship with China. Another reason why Australia has been mostly immune to seduction by militant right-wing populism relates to what I have already suggested is an imperturbable and pragmatic national temperament. This seems to go hand in hand with what Brett identifies as the powerful majoritarian impulse and lack of worship of individual rights in the country's political culture. Correspondingly, too, the public has a discerning antennae for political moonshine, as displayed, for example, by its swift waking up to Scott Morrison's poorly fitted donning of garments of Trumpism. his habitual sophistries and shameless blame shifting. Voters came to loathe him for it. History suggests as well that Australians have little truck with leadership demagoguery. But that the centre has held better in Australia can also be attributed to institutional bulwarks. Though in common with many other countries, there is plenty of evidence in Australia of growing disenchantment with the political system. One thing that helps to put a floor under faith in the nation's democracy is the politically independent electoral authority, the Australian Electoral Commission. The AEC's trusted impartial administration of the electoral system lends integrity to the democratic process. So to the whole raft of procedures it manages to facilitate voting. To name a few: Saturday election days, assistance for the ill and aged and those from non-English speaking backgrounds, mobile polling stations, postal absentee and early voting, and active and regular updating of registration. Indeed, Australia has been described as the most voter-friendly country in the world. Contrast this to state-based voter suppression practices in the United States. Voter participation is, of course, mandated by the other major institutional bedrock of the nation's electoral system, compulsory voting. As noted early on, compulsory voting has kept voter turnout at elections above 90% over the past half-century. It is a level of participation marvelled at and envied by kindred democracies. It affords legitimacy to election outcomes in this country. Significantly, it also produces a socially even turnout. Compare this to the situation in this month's United Kingdom election. Turnout there is estimated to have slumped to a record low in the 50% range, with a clear pattern of the haves exercising much greater say at the ballot box than the have-nots. Those who stayed away from the polls were predominantly less well-off, non-homeowners, the young, the lower educated and of minority ethnic background. Australia is not blemish-free in this regard. Low and declining turnout and remote electorates with high Indigenous populations is the most worrying chink in the performance of compulsory voting. In 2022, turnout in the Northern Territory seat of Lingiari fell to 66.8%. Even so, the practice largely succeeds in achieving inclusive voter participation across the country. Crucially, compulsory voting is also recognised for its moderating influence because it ensures that it is not only impassioned partisans at either end of the political spectrum who participate in elections and who are therefore the chief focus of governments and parties. Under a compulsory voting system, middle-of-the-road citizens and their concerns and sensibilities count. Politics, as a consequence, generally gravitates to the centre, inhibiting the trend towards polarisation and grievance politics evident in other parts of the globe. What I have described as Australia's democratic exceptionalism is not a cause for complacency. The 21st century has mostly been a story of underperformance in national politics, as evidenced in such things as instability in government and policy stasis. In that environment, as already noted, public confidence in the political system has dwindled. The introduction of compulsory voting 100 years ago sprang out of a spirit of innovation and experimentation in democratic practices going back to the colonial era. Perhaps it's time to mine that spirit once more. Thank you. And now I'll introduce my good colleague Matteo Bonotti from Monash.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. And I would also like to thank the Senate staff for inviting and welcoming me, Emeritus Professor Paul Strangio, here today. My talk will start from a slightly different approach. I'm a political theorist, whereas Emeritus Professor Paul Strangio is a political historian. And so I will, as a political theorist, I tend to focus on the conceptual and theoretical dimensions of institutions and politics, as well as on normative questions, questions about what should we do about compulsory voting, or about freedom, about democracy. And my talk today will focus on a specific conception in political theory, which is the idea of public reason, to explain why compulsory voting is important to promote public reason in Australian democracy. But first, let me give you a brief outline of what I will talk about. There are a number of arguments in political theory that support compulsory voting. Some of the most influential are, for example, the idea that compulsory voting contributes to greater democratic representativeness. As Professor Strangio mentioned, sometimes it's the members of more disadvantaged groups who do not tend to vote under voluntary voting system. So compulsory voting is considered important and valuable by many precisely because it helps to ensure that members of disadvantaged groups in terms of social class, ethnicity, gender, and so on, vote, and therefore that their voices are heard in the political system. Another important argument is that compulsory voting facilitates the coordination among like-minded people, because when voting is voluntary, the argument goes, people who believe in the same values or who have similar interests sometimes might not be able to coordinate and ensure that they all vote and therefore that their cause is advanced. And this is more likely, once again, among more disadvantaged groups, because groups that are more disadvantaged in terms of financial resources, for example, will be more capable of mobilizing their voice and being heard by politicians, through lobbies or through various forms of influence, whereas more disadvantaged groups are less likely to do so. So compulsory voting ensures that all members of disadvantaged groups vote, because otherwise some of them may think, why should I vote if other members of my group are unlikely to vote. So compulsory voting prevents that sort of reasoning and ensures that people can coordinate. And finally, another argument is that not voting is unfair. If our fellow citizens are voting, making the effort to vote in order to contribute to the well-being of our democratic institutions, if I, as a citizen, do not vote, I'm unfair towards them. So compulsory voting helps to ensure that people do not act in an unfair way towards their fellow citizens. So I'll come back to these points later, but I wanted to introduce them to highlight the fact that the argument I will defend here is different. It's based on the idea of public reason, which is an idea very influential in my discipline in political theory, an idea first introduced by John Rawls, who's probably the most important political philosopher, political theorist of the 20th century. And so I will first introduce the concept of public reason to explain what it is, why it's important, and that will illustrate, I will explain why I think compulsory voting in countries like Australia, so especially in parliamentary democracies like Australia, it's important to promote public reason, and why that matters for the political legitimacy of laws and policies in Australia, countries like Australia. I will conclude by relating my argument to the three arguments that I've just illustrated, and the arguments that compulsory voting makes a political system more representative, that helps people to coordinate, like-minded people to coordinate, and that it prevents unfair behavior by voters. So what is public reason? As I said, the idea was introduced by John Rawls, important political theorist, in his book Political Liberalism, originally published in the early 90s, 1993, and then republished in various editions. And just to clarify, to avoid any confusion, the term liberalism and the concept of liberalism in political liberalism, in the kind of political theory that I'm talking about today, is unrelated to the Liberal Party of Australia or to many other liberal parties. It's a specific idea in political theory, is a technical term which is centered around this idea of public reason. So what is this idea of public reason? Basically, the idea is that for laws, for policies to be legitimate in a society, they need to be justified by those who promote them. So the government, in a society like Australia, in any society, in any liberal democracy at least, should not simply impose laws and policies by force or just because those laws have been endorsed by a majority. Instead, there should be a sort of justification for those laws. Politicians especially should provide arguments for the laws and policies that they promote in parliament or during electoral campaigns, arguments which can appeal to the public good of all citizens. So you cannot, for example, as a politician say, oh, I defend this tax cut because it's good for me or my family or this specific interest group in society. Normally, politicians, we expect politicians to say things like, I defend this tax cut because I think it's good for the well-being of the overall community because it will improve economic growth, or vice versa. I defend increasing taxes in this area because I think, or my party thinks, that they're better for the whole political community, not just because they're good for this or that specific interest group. So there should always be an effort to formulate the justification for policies and laws by appealing to the public good, which is by appealing to what Rawls and political liberals call public reasons. So reasons that appeal to publicly relevant arguments, so reasons that relate to individual rights and liberties. So we should implement this law because it will strengthen a specific right for all citizens. That could be the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, anything. Or because this law increases fair equality of opportunity, or because it promotes the common good. Think about, for example, public health policies that they had to promote the common good. They're often justified in that way. And also public reasons include scientific evidence. Now, we expect politicians to really appeal to facts, scientific evidence, scientific research when justifying policies, not to false information. So this is what public reason is, basically. Laws and policies are only legitimate when they're justified in this way, by appealing to these kinds of broad-minded arguments that appeal to the interest of the whole political community. Why is all of this important? Why should politicians, for example, do this? Well, the key assumptions behind this idea of public reason are two. First, the societies are diverse. Social diversity is a fact in Australia. It's a fact in any liberal democracy, in any society in the world. And because of that, you cannot, according to this argument, justify a law by appealing to a controversial view. Imagine if a politician said, no, I think that we should implement this law because it's based on Catholicism, or because it's based on Islam, or because it's based on any controversial doctrine that not all citizens endorse. Now, there are many citizens in Australia who are not Catholic, or not Muslims, many are atheists, so it's unjust, it's unfair to impose upon them a policy based solely on a justification that is grounded in a controversial view, like a controversial religious view, for example. So this is the first assumption, social diversity. And the second is that if we do impose a law on our fellow citizens based on these controversial arguments, we fail to treat them as free and equal citizens. We fail to treat them as free because, according to political liberalism, there's a presumption for freedom. So citizens are free. So any imposition, any law or policy that is imposed upon them is a limitation of that freedom, and that requires a justification. That's why we need to provide public reasons for policies. And second, that freedom should be recognized to all citizens. That's the equal status. That's the equality element of the assumption, of the premise. All citizens should be treated as free and equal persons, and therefore we should ensure that we provide reasons that all of them can accept in a diverse society when we defend a certain policy or a certain law. So, what does this mean in practice? Well, there's been, as you might imagine, there's been a lot of discussion in political theory about this. Normally, a standard way of explaining how this works in practice is the idea that citizens should avoid, so any citizen, any ordinary citizens in a society should avoid using controversial reasons like religious reasons, for example, to justify their preferred laws and policies. This is sometimes called the direct model of public reason, but this is too demanding. Now, as you might imagine, many critics of public reason have argued that if you prevent, for example, religious citizens from appealing to their religious beliefs when they defend their policy positions, when they explain why they voted for a certain party rather than another, that would be very limiting. No, it would almost undermine their integrity. If you're a religious person, for example, it's difficult for you to divide your private self from your public self, not to set aside your beliefs, your religious beliefs, when you are participating in political life. This is a very common critique. So a second understanding of the implications of public reason focuses more on politicians. No, when I introduced public reason, I was referring often to politicians, not like MPs, members of parliament, ministers, and so on. I think that this is the right approach. I think the citizens should be free to use whichever arguments they want to use to justify their political positions, but then it's politicians who should really use public reasons to justify the policies and laws they implement. So if constituents support a certain law because of some religious or other controversial reason, it is the duty of the representative, of their MP, to reformulate, so to speak, the justifications for the policy in a way that appeals to the public good. So to say, no, for example, this is good for those who live in this area, or this is good for members of a certain religious group, but this is good for Australia as a whole, because X and Y and Z reasons, and these reasons need to be public. And I think that is the right approach to public reason. And linked to this is the idea that institutions in a society should be designed in a way that encourages this way of thinking. Because politicians, of course, have flaws. They may sometimes not feel incentivized to think and justify their policies in terms of public reason. So we should try to design institutions in a way that encourages them to do so. And this is what leads me to my argument about compulsory voting, and it's important for public reason. So to understand what this importance of compulsory voting is, we need to understand what kind of democracy Australia is. Here I rely again on John Rawls, especially in this distinction between what he calls constitutional democracy on the one hand and parliamentary supremacy regimes or democracies on the other hand. So constitutional democracies are countries like the US, not the United States. There's a separation of powers, and there's a very strong Supreme Court that basically has the duty to protect citizens' individual rights and liberties, which are obviously protected, guaranteed by the Constitution, and to ensure that those rights and liberties are not violated by majoritarian decisions. Now, this is what the US Supreme Court does all the time. In Australia, it's different. Now, Australia is often considered a parliamentary supremacy democracy, a parliamentary supremacy regime, because the protection of individual rights and liberties is not really guaranteed, or not mainly guaranteed by a constitutional court, like the Supreme Court in the US, but by democratic monitoring. So it's the democratic system and parliament that have the task, have the duty. So let me provide a couple of examples of what this means. The first is a quote from Lisa Hill, an important scholar of compulsory voting. According to Hill, quote, the absence of entrenched rights in the Australian Constitution reflected the belief on the part of the framers that the law produced by a popularly elected parliament was the best safeguard of rights, end quote. Likewise, Mann, who was a nationalist member of the House of Representatives, when defending compulsory voting before this was introduced, argued individual liberty is less likely to be invaded when the legal control is exercised by the real majority of the people, end quote. So you can see that in the Australian context, the protection of rights and liberties happens, is guaranteed not through a Supreme Court that exists outside, so to speak, the democratic system, outside the parliamentary system, but by the parliament itself. And obviously members of parliament are elected by voters. So there's a close democratic monitoring of individual rights and liberties. So my argument, based on this understanding of Australia, which of course can be contested, and that there's a literature about this, but Australia is certainly closer to the parliamentary supremacy regime model than to the US model, so to speak. My central argument based on this is that compulsory voting is desirable, and citizens have a duty to vote in countries like Australia, and to vote based on whichever reason they want, even controversial reasons, precisely in order to contribute to the political and institutional process through which the individual rights and liberties are protected, but also through which non-public reasons are excluded from public justification, and therefore public reason is promoted. So when citizens vote, when everyone votes, they contribute to electing their MPs, of course, and it's the task of their MPs to engage in the process of public reasoning in order to ensure that laws and policies are justified by appealing to public reason, by appealing to the public good, not to controversial reasons. By voting, citizens enable the system to function and to ensure that the system filters out non-public reasons. This is why voting should be compulsory. So why, then we need to ask, why and how will the system filter out public reasons if we have compulsory voting? And this is what I'm going to explain in the last part of my talk. So let me return to the three arguments that I introduced at the beginning of my talk. The first, if you remember, was this idea that compulsory voting helps to ensure that a political system is more representative. Because normally when vote is voluntary, it's members of more disadvantaged groups who do not vote. Compulsory voting helps to ensure that members of these groups vote and that their interests and voices are heard. And there's evidence that this normally leads to more egalitarian and progressive policies. For example, in Australia, for instance, there's evidence that the introduction of compulsory voting was followed soon by dramatic increases in turnout and pension spending, for example. There are many other studies that have looked at this aspect. But what I want to focus on is a different idea. So think again about public reason. What happens when everyone votes is that more voices are represented in parliament, not by citizens directly, of course, but by their representatives. There will be more diverse representatives and more diverse views represented by those representatives because everyone has had their voice, all citizens. So what that contributes to is what I called elsewhere in the previous work, justificatory pressure on legislators. Why? Because if, let's say, a politician, a member of the majority, whichever party is in power, is defending a law, a policy, there will be opposition MPs who have been elected by a more diverse range of people, of voters, who will be able to contest, to demand public justifications for the policy. Now, if only if members of the disadvantaged groups were not voting under voluntary voting systems, for example, their voices wouldn't necessarily be heard in parliament because there wouldn't be as many representatives representing their interest in parliament, and there wouldn't be as many representatives contesting government policies based on the interest of these disadvantaged groups. So compulsory voting helps to ensure that there are more MPs in the parliament who are acting and speaking on behalf of members of more disadvantaged groups, and if and where necessary, criticizing, contesting government policies, proposed government policies, and demanding public justifications for those policies. So this is one advantage of compulsory voting for the process of public reasoning. A second advantage relates to the second argument that I introduced at the beginning, the coordination argument, this idea that compulsory voting helps like-minded people to coordinate, especially members of more disadvantaged groups. So here, the argument is, the relation with public reasoning is that when everyone votes, when all citizens vote, all citizens, including members of more disadvantaged groups, can coordinate more easily in order to create a sort of critical mass of voters who advance certain interests and to ensure that those interests are heard in parliament. So it's similar to the first argument, but focuses more to the importance of coordination among like-minded people. So if everyone is forced to vote, so we can ensure the members of disadvantaged groups will not fail to coordinate with one another and will vote advancing the same interests and values, and that will create a critical mass which will have an influence on the representatives, and that will ensure that the representatives in parliament, hopefully at least, will contest government decisions and demand public reasons, public justifications for government policies. So that will also contribute to this sort of justificatory pressure on legislators. And third, and finally, the argument based on fairness, as I explained earlier, this is the idea that by not voting, a citizen is being unfair towards their fellow citizens, and therefore compulsory voting prevents this sort of free riding, because their fellow citizens are making the effort of voting and contributing to the well-being of the democratic system. So each citizen should vote, because otherwise it would be unfair for them to free ride on their fellow citizens voting. So the implications for public reason here is that if my fellow citizens are voting, they are contributing to public reasoning, not because they are ensuring that there's a representative system in which non-public reasons are filtered out, in which the interests of all groups are taken into account, in which legislators are constantly under justificatory pressure, so under pressure to provide public reasons for policies, to justify the policies by appealing to public good. If other citizens are doing this, if I'm not doing this, I'm being unfair towards them. I'm free riding on their work, on their effort. And therefore, voting should be compulsory precisely because we should prevent this sort of free riding. And because everyone should have a duty to contribute to the systemic process of public reasoning in a liberal democracy. So my conclusion is therefore that in countries like Australia, characterized by a parliamentary supremacy regime, compulsory voting can play a key role in ensuring the process of public reasoning through which public officials provide public justifications and public reasons for laws, and to ensure that this policy takes into account the interests and voices and values of a broad variety of citizens, a broad variety of perspectives, not just members of more advantaged groups. And a more responsive public reasoning, I believe, leads to a more publicly justified political system, to more publicly justified laws and policies, which are also more legitimate in a diverse society like Australia. For these reasons, I think compulsory voting is good for political legitimacy in Australia and other liberal democracies with similar political systems. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a couple of questions, so if you would like to ask a question, just perhaps raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk, professors. I have two questions. So you mentioned that the compulsory voting could be marginally beneficial for the ALP. Why do you think that's the case? And is there any evidence that compulsory voting could be beneficial or harmful to the crossbenchers in the minor parties?
That is an argument that it benefited the Labor Party compulsory voting that has historical roots in the idea that the working class, less educated people were less likely to vote in a voluntary system. Now that argument, of course, has been eroded given the sort of changing demographics and patterns of voter support for the major parties. In fact, we now know that, if anything, those of higher education attainment are now skewing towards the left of centre in their political choices, so perhaps more favouring the Labor Party and the Greens. So I think that argument has diminished a strength in Australia, and I doubt, therefore, that some of the push for overturning compulsory voting in the Liberal Party would anymore have traction for that reason. So, as I said, it was always somewhat disputed in the literature, and it was only ever seen as a minor benefit. But as I said, I don't think that would stand up now.
I've got a question here, and then perhaps another question there.
Both our speakers seem to have been talking mainly about the federal, the state or the referendum level. What about the local and city government level? For instance, where you're required to vote by virtue of a property ownership. Melbourne City Council, to take the city in which you both would appear to live.
Well, again, it varies across the country. I wrote the article in The Conversation on Monday about compulsory voting and the anniversary, and there was did a number of media interviews, and one of the things that quickly became apparent, depending on what state you're in, there was variation in terms of whether local government elections were compulsory or not. Not the case in Western Australia, from what I could work out, for instance, whereas where I come from in Victoria, there's compulsion. So it does vary. And what you saw again, they were noting in Western Australia, you're getting a turnout of around 30% in the absence of compulsion. It is fascinating that Australia has compulsion at both the national and the state level. We should remember, though we're marking the centenary of national compulsion, actually Queensland led the way in 1915 with the adoption of compulsory voting. Then it sped to the national sphere, and after that, the next 2 decades, to each of the states and in turn to the territories. It was a gradual process, but the local government is still that variation.
If I may add, a short point, thank you for the question. I think that's a great question because it is true that this whole idea of public reason often focuses on the national level or federal level. But there are important questions to be asked about what does it mean at the local level, because what counts as the public good sometimes at the state level, the council level is different, obviously, from what counts as the public good at the national or federal level. So I think there should be more work and more thinking done around what the public good demands at the local level, therefore what kind of reasons counts as public reasons and what that means for compulsory voting. So it's definitely something that has been unexplored. So thank you for the question.
We do have a question here, Nicole, thank you.
Look, thanks for very interesting lectures. I'd like to go back to the international view. With the emergence of newly independent nations over the last 50, 60 years, and more recently in Eastern Europe, has there been a move to compulsory voting in any new democracies? And also, I think Keir Starmer has said he's going to move voting to a Saturday to make it easier. Can you comment on the accompanying measures that might be needed and some international views there?
It's interesting, from what I can work out, where compulsory voting, the growth in compulsory voting has been in South America, South American countries in more recent times. It used to have a strong presence in Europe, for example, historically, but it gradually fell away in European countries. I'm not aware of whether it's there's any presence of compulsory voting in Eastern Europe. Matteo, you might. So, as I said, the growth seems to be in South American countries. It is interesting that Starmer's talking about Saturday elections, because, of course, there was historic reasons for why voting in UK was on. It's Tuesdays, isn't it? Thursdays. In the US it's on a Tuesday. But again, this was seen as a very significant thing that Australia, because of compulsion, it was therefore incumbent for electoral authorities to make it as easy to vote as possible. Because you're going to have compulsion, you've got to make it accessible. So it's almost like those things followed, and the AEC has been very good at that. So, you know, that's right. It doesn't end with compulsion. You therefore have to do certain other things to make it as accessible as feasible.
Thank you. Just a quick point. I'm also not aware of widespread use of compulsory voting in Eastern Europe. What I'm thinking of is that there's a growing emphasis on the idea of democratic innovations to counter the crisis of democracy that everyone talks about. What I predict, there are many mechanisms that have been proposed to counter the crisis of democracy, the use of deliberative democracy, for example, so sortition. But I suspect that compulsory voting may come back also in European debates, precisely because there's a demand for greater citizen participation. So that's the most direct way of increasing citizen participation, alongside other institutional measures like deliberative assemblies, citizens' assemblies, which add a more deliberative dimension to democracy, because compulsory voting is just about voting, but there are also other important ways in which we can improve the quality of democracy. So that's my prediction, but I may be wrong.
And these debates do bubble up. In the United States, Barack Obama said 2 great things about Australia: gun control and compulsory voting. But it's unthinkable, I think, in the United States, because it's very powerful individual rights culture, I think, compulsory voting.
I'm sorry, we are out of time for questions. I can see that we have some demand for more of your wonderful remarks and thoughts. So thank you both for a thought-provoking lecture, and thank you all for joining us here in the room and online. A recording of this lecture and information about future lectures will be available on the Senate Lecture Series page at aph.gov.au. If you aren't already subscribed, please sign up at the table outside or email us to get on our mailing list. That does unfortunately bring us to a conclusion, but I would like to give a great personal thanks to you both for such a thought-provoking lecture, helping us commemorate 100 years of compulsory voting in Commonwealth elections. Will you all please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers?